Welcome to that show out west for that team out west. An unbiased, neutral observer's view of Oregon Ducks football. I'm Ted LaRue. There has been a lot of movement in and out of Eugene, Oregon. Of course, that January 15th NFL draft entry deadline is fast approaching. There are some decisions that still need to be made, but Josh Conerly has certainly made his decision. He's moving on to the NFL. Derek Harmon at defensive tackle. You look at Jordan James at running back. Of course, Trayshawn Holden over there at wide receiver. They are going to do great things in the next stage of their football careers. You've seen some incoming transfers. Malik Benson, former Alabama and Florida State wide receiver, will join that room to certainly provide some depth to it. There's a lot of excitement with Mekhi Hughes coming into Eugene. Noah Whittington still has a decision to make if he wants to come back to this Ducks program. But man, a backfield of Mekhi Hughes and Noah Whittington, that is a chef's kiss of a tandem and could be a chef's kiss of a run game behind Dante Moore next season. But when you talk about players staying and planting all 10 toes on the ground here on the West Coast in Eugene, first on offense, it's Evan Stewart. And I expected Evan Stewart to come back for one more year. But one that I was kind of on the fence on is Bryce Boettcher. And he is coming back for 2025. I'm sure this got you psyched, and this got me psyched for what this Oregon defense could certainly be next season. And this commentary, this video is all about the defensive side of the football. Okay, so when you look at this thing from Bryce Boettcher's perspective, a 13th round draft pick of the Houston Astros organization on the baseball field. He's had a great career in center field for this Oregon Ducks baseball program as well. He could have easily looked at this season. I had a great year, led the team in tackles, had a breakout performance on the defensive side of the football, finished my football career with my hometown team. We went out there, we won the Big Ten championship. We won 13 games in our very first season in the Big Ten conference. Could have easily rode off into the sunset, and that could have been that. And he would have started his career in the minor leagues within this Houston Astros organization. That would have been perfectly understandable. But he chose to come back to Oregon. He said with that decision, there is unfinished business on the football field. Bryce coming back to this Ducks defense is huge in so many different ways. Let's start first with the intangibles. I think Bryce Boettcher, I think he was already maybe the heart and soul of this defense this season. He is certainly going to be the heart and soul and the vocal leader in the offseason, in the weight room, in spring practice, in fall camp, when they have done their required reps, maybe by the strength and conditioning staff. Bryce says, let's do one more set. Let's take it. Let's push it that much further. Let's get that much better during this offseason, because he's coming back to take it further than the college football playoff quarterfinals. He's coming back to take it further than what the Oregon Ducks were able to do certainly this season. I think he is going to light the fire around this defensive group, not only in the linebacker room, defensive line, edge rusher, secondary, right? I think he's going to bring everybody together. We all know the story about Bryce, the double walk-on, the Eugene, Oregon kid. Like, that is infectious. I think his passion for this program, I think, is going to rub off on, especially on a lot of these young guys that are going to be expected to step up into bigger roles for Oregon this season. Okay, now if we look at it between the lines a little bit, I like that what this gives in terms of time for development for some younger guys in this room, and I also like what it means for the depth at linebacker. First of all, you got to look at, I know Oregon 4-2-5, 3-3-5, they kind of mix around what they look like defensively. Like they're one of those defenses where I don't really know what they are, right? They move around, which is certainly an advantage. I certainly like what Tosh Lupoi has certainly done in that perspective as well. But you're going to pair Bryce Boettcher alongside Devin Jackson. These are two guys that weren't expected to be really key contributors at the level that they ended up being, I should probably say, in 2024. To start the season, you were looking at Jeffrey Bassa. You were looking at Justin Jacobs. Both of those guys were kind of banged up to start the season, and that's where you saw Bryce step up. That's where you saw Devin Jackson step up. And Devin Jackson, he might be one of the fastest players on the field at any given time. He's certainly one of the fastest players on this Oregon defense. But now you have solidified starters at your linebacker position. If Bryce Boettcher did not come back for 2025, you would have lost the aforementioned Jeffrey Bassa. You would have lost the aforementioned Justin Jacobs. You would have lost Bryce Boettcher. You would have lost a good amount in the linebacker room. Now, they are certainly losing depth in the linebacker room, but when you look at experience, when you look at guys that are going to be in those starting roles, I think they feel pretty good about those first-line guys at the linebacker position as well. And because of Bryce coming back and not having maybe a younger guy or a portal addition starting in that role, it allows some of these younger guys one more year to maybe develop and improve their game and become depth pieces, maybe on their way to eventually becoming starters. You're looking at a guy like Gavin Nix in this incoming freshman class. Braden Platt, Jerry Mixon are just a couple of names that are going to be able to provide depth where maybe Bryce Boettcher and Devin Jackson were able to provide depth last season. And we all know injuries happen, right? So if you can get these guys experience, and if one of these starters certainly goes down, then that provides a better opportunity for these young guys to certainly step up and be a bigger part of this defense. I think there's still a possibility that Oregon could still add one portal addition at linebacker, but I think there's also a possibility that they could look around, and we'll see how they feel as the winter goes on and as spring football certainly approaches, to see they might sit back and say, okay, we're going to ride with our young guys. We're going to ride with Boettcher and Jackson, of course, as our starters. It should be very interesting to see what happens at the linebacker position as well. But this goes further, I think, than the linebacker, because I want to take this beyond to look at the entire defense. And an early defensive outlook, I know we're in the month of January, right? There's certainly some perspective that needs to be added to this, but this is kind of a jumping off point, I think, for the defense as we approach spring, as we approach fall camp here in the coming months as well. First point that I want to make is I want to talk about the defensive line. Mikael Gardner, high 3-star, low 4-star type of guy from a recruiting class a couple of years back. He has transferred out of this program. Considering what Oregon was possibly losing up front on the defensive line, there was maybe a school of thought that said, hey, he could maybe be in the rotation on the defensive line this season, but I think him transferring out really flexes the muscles and shows the depth that Oregon is going to have on the defensive line. I think Gardner transferring out could, not saying it will, but it could signal the return of Jamari Caldwell. Now remember, Jamari Caldwell was a JUCO player at one time. So now, because of this lawsuit with Diego Pavia, he could have that exemption to come back for one more season. And remember, they brought in a transfer from USC, Bear Alexander, right? I know he's kind of had his problems throughout his career, early on in his career, but if they can just get a good Bear Alexander, you don't need to hit the ceiling, you don't need to hit great. If Jamari Caldwell comes back, if Bear Alexander is good, this is looking like a pretty good interior defensive line, and maybe the transfer of Gardner, who is very, very much a depth piece and who I think at best would have been a depth piece, signals the depth in this defensive line room for the Oregon Ducks, and I think it signals a little bit of optimism, I think, what they have on the defensive line. I mentioned Jamari Caldwell. I mentioned Bear Alexander. And then you look at Amari Washington, who was, outside of Derek Harmon, outside of Caldwell. He was in that next rotation, and he was certainly rotating and getting a good amount of snaps and certainly making some plays for Tosh Lupuy's defense this season. So you got to think Amari. I think if Jamari Caldwell does come back, I think it's probably going to be Amari Washington as the leader in the clubhouse over Bear Alexander at the defensive tackle position, but there's a long way to go, certainly between now and then. And then you look at some of these young guys, the Terrence Greens and the Aiden Brelands and some of these other guys that they've recruited over the past couple of years that they are certainly excited about. So I think there's a good amount of depth up front on the defensive line. I feel really good about that. And I feel really good about the D-line, the edge rushers, the inside linebackers, the outside linebackers, the front six, the front seven, right? Whatever you want to call it, I feel really good about it. I talked about the interior of the defensive line, and then you have, of course, Mateo Uiagalelei. You have Tatum Tuioti that are going to be back, that are at that edge position, that jack linebacker type of position. They kind of move those guys around certainly a little bit. Two different players, of course, with Tatum and Mateo, but I feel very good about that. I'm very curious to see what this defensive front is going to look like. Are they going to move Mateo to the Jordan Birch position? That's what I would expect, and you would have a defensive line with Mateo Uiagalelei, Jamari Caldwell, and Amari Washington up front. I feel pretty good about that. Now, Derek Harmon is certainly a big piece to replace, but a spring, a fall camp, time to develop, maybe as a unit, they could get back to that level for 2025. And then you look at Blake Purchase, who's been in this program for a couple of years. I think that this is a big offseason for him to be able to step up and provide depth coming off of the edge. Elijah Rushing, what a great name for an edge rusher, right? By the way, I think he was a 5-star coming out of the state of Arizona, if I remember correctly. He was a true freshman this year, showed a lot of pop on tape. Another year in the weight room, another spring. He's a guy that could step up into a bigger role, certainly. So I'm curious of what they're going to do and how they're going to structure this with the outside linebacker versus the edge versus the defensive end position. But maybe that's another talking point for another day down the road. But with all of those names I mentioned and with the potential that I see there with some of these young kids, I feel very confident. I feel very good about the front six, front seven of this group. Will they be as good as last season? That's going to be the question. I certainly think that they have the potential to, at the very least, be at that level, if not exceed that level in 2025. Now, as good and let's say maybe as sure as I feel about those front groups, I got some questions in the back end of the secondary. That's the big one for me. I need answers, and I'm not going to get them right now. I'm not going to get them in February. I'm not going to get them in March, April, May. It's going to be a while, right? It's going to be a while before we really find out some of these answers to some of these questions in the secondary. But you're going to lose Jabbar Muhammad, Nico Reed, right? Your top two corners. You're going to lose Brandon Johnson. You're going to lose Tysheem Johnson. You're going to lose Dante Manning. You lose almost everybody in the secondary. We talked about the JUCO exemption, with Jamari Caldwell. Kobe Savage, the safety trainer who came over from Kansas State this past season, yeah, he got turned around. He got spun like a top by Jeremiah Smith in that Rose Bowl. There's no question about that. He can come back. He's got a decision to make. I think that would really help out the depth. But I'm not sure if there would be a guaranteed starting spot for Kobe Savage, considering these players, some of these talented young players that I'm about to mention. And it's these young players that I think, the theme for 2025 is going to be, all right, Dan Lanning, you've recruited 5 stars and 4 stars, tons of blue chip players over the last 2 years. Now it's time for those guys to get on the field and show what they can do. Everybody says they've got higher ceilings than these transfers that Oregon has been able to bring in. Now it's time to be able to see that. We've heard people ranting and raving over some of these guys and what they've shown in practice. Let's see it in the game. Let's see it on the field. There is so much youth in this group right now. I feel pretty good, pretty sure that these 2 secondary transfers that they brought in, Dylan Thieneman coming over from Purdue at safety, Theron Johnson coming over from Northwestern at corner, I feel fairly solidified that those are going to be plug-and-play starters, but then you got to figure out the other 3 positions in the back end of this defense. We'll see what Kobe Savage does. I think that's a little bit of a pivot point as well for the secondary. But when you look at these young guys, there are all kinds of names, folks. All kinds of names. Jaleel Florence, Sione Lalea, right? Those are guys that have been around this program a couple of years. Jaleel Florence was banged up this season. I think if Jaleel Florence is healthy, he plays a very big role on this Ducks defense in 2024. But I think the smart money for maybe the starting corners for next year is Theron Johnson on one side and Jaleel Florence on the other side. But then you start to get into guys that have been on campus for a year or two. The Peyton Woodyards, the Roderick Pleasants, Dakota Fields, Aaron Flowers, Kingston Lopa, Dalen Austin, right? These are low 5-star, high 4-star, top 100, top 150, top 200 players in their class. And they've been on campus now. They've learned the scheme. Now it's time to maybe translate that. And they are going to be expected. I'm not saying all of them, but I think there's going to be a good amount of young guys that are going to be expected to come into pretty significant roles for this defense in 2025. And then how these true freshmen. You look at Trey McNutt, you look at Naeem Offord, you look at Dorian Brew, kind of like these other guys that have been on campus for a year. I said, hey, maybe not all three of those guys are going to, and Brandon Finney is another one of those guys, right, that are going to be expected to step up in and play on the field a good amount, but maybe one of them will, maybe two of them will, right? So you want to make sure that they're ready to certainly step into that role when that comes time. But the secondary, that's the big one. Those are the big questions that I have about this Oregon defense. But I think that this is an Oregon defense that can play on the level that they certainly did last season. Excited to see what happens. Those are my thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts. Bryce Boettcher coming back and what this defense looks like. Do you agree with me saying, hey, the defensive line, edge rushers, and linebackers look pretty good? There's some confidence there. There's some optimism there. And what are your thoughts on the secondary? Leave all of that in the comments below. This has been That Show Out West for That Team Out West. I'm Ted LaRue.